Somewhere along the way, you've probably met someone who was clearly intelligent on paper, degrees, credentials, a sharp memory for facts, and still managed to make the same avoidable mistakes over and over, seemingly incapable of learning from any of them. And you've probably also met someone with none of those credentials who somehow navigated life, relationships, and hard decisions with a kind of clarity that made everyone around them a little wiser just by proximity. That gap is the whole point of this video. Intelligence, measured by what you know, and wisdom, measured by how you live, are not the same thing. And mistaking one for the other is exactly how smart people end up making foolish decisions their whole lives without ever understanding why. It's worth being honest, too, about why this particular gap is so easy to miss in ourselves specifically, even when we spot it instantly in other people. Intelligence is visible. It shows up in test scores, job titles, the ability to win an argument in the moment. Wisdom is quieter, and it only really becomes visible over a much longer time scale, in the accumulated pattern of how someone actually handled the hard moments in their life, not the easy ones. That delay is exactly why a genuinely foolish pattern can persist for years, even decades, without the person running it ever getting clear, immediate feedback that something needs to change. Over the next 29 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 6 unmistakable signs that someone, and this includes all of us at various points, is operating from a place of foolishness rather than wisdom, regardless of how many books they've read or degrees they hold. This isn't a list built to help you point fingers at other people. It's a mirror, and if you're honest while looking into it, at least one of these 6 is going to land somewhere uncomfortably close to home. Stay through to the end, because the 6th sign is the one that quietly damages the relationships closest to you the most, and almost nobody recognizes it in themselves while it's happening. Before we get into the 6 signs themselves, it's worth being precise about what we're actually measuring, because the distinction matters for everything that follows. Wisdom, in the way the Stoics understood it, was never about accumulating the most correct answers. It was about the ongoing capacity to notice when you're wrong, adjust, and keep growing, a moving target rather than a fixed credential you earn once and carry forever. Foolishness, by that same measure, isn't a lack of information. It's a kind of stuckness, a refusal, conscious or not, to let new information change anything about how you think or act. Every sign on this list is really just a different flavor of that same underlying refusal. There's a reason all 6 of these traits tend to travel together rather than showing up in isolation, worth naming before we get into the specifics. Each one protects the person exhibiting it from a specific kind of discomfort, the discomfort of being wrong, of being challenged, of admitting a limit, of feeling someone else's pain, of facing the unfamiliar, of sitting quietly while someone else has the floor. Foolishness, looked at this way, isn't really a character flaw in the way it's usually described. It's a set of avoidance strategies, each one effective at dodging one specific kind of short-term discomfort, and each one quietly expensive over the long run in ways that rarely show up on the same timescale as the discomfort they're avoiding. 1. A closed mind. A closed mind isn't really the absence of intelligence. It's intelligence that's stopped moving, a fortress built, brick by brick, out of fear, pride, and plain stubbornness, defended long after the ground underneath it has shifted. I watched this play out directly with a department manager I once worked alongside. I'll call him Mark. Mark had run his team's processes the same way for the better part of a decade, and by his own account, That history was proof enough that the approach still worked. When a younger employee suggested modern project management software that might have closed a widening gap with competing teams, Mark waved it off almost instantly. "We've done it this way for 10 years, and it's worked fine." What followed wasn't neutral. While other teams in the company made real, visible progress, Mark's team quietly fell further behind, weighed down by processes nobody had questioned in years. And when the underperformance became impossible to ignore, Mark's explanation never once turned inward. He blamed his staff, blamed the market, blamed bad luck, anything except the entrenched mindset that had actually caused the problem. What's worth understanding about closed minds generally is that they rarely announce themselves as closed. They usually present as confidence, a settled certainty that feels, from the inside, like the product of hard-won experience rather than what it often actually is, a refusal to update. Genuine confidence, the kind that actually holds up under pressure, comes from a very different place, an acceptance that you can't possibly know everything, paired with an active willingness to keep learning anyway. The confidence Mark displayed was closer to armor, built specifically to avoid the discomfort of admitting his approach might need to change. There's a specific test worth applying to distinguish the two, because from the outside they can look almost identical in the moment. Genuine confidence tends to get more curious, not less, when it encounters a disagreement. It wants to understand why the other perspective exists, because it's not actually threatened by the possibility of being wrong. The armored version does the opposite. It gets more rigid the moment it's challenged, treating the disagreement itself as the problem to be managed rather than information worth examining. Mark's response to the younger employee's suggestion, an instant dismissal rather than even a token attempt to evaluate the idea on its merits, was the second kind of confidence wearing the mask of the first. There's a version of this worth naming that shows up constantly outside the workplace too. In family arguments about parenting styles, in friendships where one person's political views calcified sometime in their 20s and haven't moved an inch since, in the neighbor who insists their way of doing things is simply how it's done. Full stop. No further discussion invited. In every version, the actual damage isn't limited to the person holding the closed mind. It spreads outward, to the team that stalls under bad management, to the child who stops bringing new ideas home, to the friendship that slowly narrows because one side has stopped being able to hear anything that doesn't already match what they believe. It's worth naming, too, why closed minds are so hard to actually correct from the outside, once you understand the mechanism at work. Telling Mark directly that his approach was outdated wouldn't have worked, and probably didn't, at various points before his team's decline became undeniable, because the closed mind isn't primarily a factual position that can be argued out of existence with better evidence. It's an emotional position, dressed up as a factual one, protecting the person from having to sit with the discomfort of admitting that a decade of confident decisions might have been wrong. Real change, in cases like this, tends to require the kind of undeniable, personal consequence Mark eventually faced, his team visibly falling behind, rather than any amount of someone else's persuasion arriving earlier. The Stoics were explicit that wisdom was never about being right consistently. It was about the capacity to adapt when the evidence called for it, treating being wrong as useful information rather than a threat to be defended against. The practical move, if you catch this pattern in yourself, is almost embarrassingly simple to state and genuinely difficult to practice. Get comfortable saying, out loud, "I was wrong, and I want to learn," not as a performance of humility, but as an actual operating habit you return to whenever the evidence in front of you contradicts what you've believed for years. Only once that specific wall comes down does anything resembling real wisdom have room to grow in its place. 2. Constant blaming. Foolish people, almost without exception, become remarkably skilled at one particular craft, the perfectly reasonable-sounding excuse. A failed project becomes the market's fault. A missed promotion becomes evidence of an unfair boss. Somewhere underneath every version of this pattern sits the same quiet mechanism. Blame functions as a shield, protecting the blamer from having to look directly at an uncomfortable truth about their own contribution to the outcome. I saw this play out clearly with an event organizer I once worked with. I'll call her Lisa, who was responsible for planning a major conference that ultimately flopped due to weak attendance. Her first instinct, immediate and confident, was to blame the marketing team for failing to promote the event adequately. What the actual investigation turned up told a different story. Lisa herself had sent the event details late, which delayed the entire marketing campaign from ever getting proper lead time. Even once that fact was clearly established, she kept pointing outward rather than inward, refusing to name her own role in what had happened. The consequence wasn't abstract. Her colleagues' trust in her eroded steadily, and within a relatively short time, she'd stepped down from the position entirely. What's worth understanding about the shield blame provides is that it's genuinely protective in the short term. It spares you the discomfort of confronting a mistake directly, and genuinely corrosive over any longer timescale, because a shield that blocks discomfort also blocks the specific information you'd need to actually improve. Responsibility, uncomfortable as it is to hold, is the only door that leads anywhere useful. People who admit their mistakes aren't doing it because they enjoy the sting of criticism. They're doing it because they understand, correctly, that an honest account of what went wrong is the only version of events that contains anything worth learning from. There's a specific irony worth naming in Lisa's story because it applies far beyond her particular situation. The version of events she protected, that the marketing team had simply failed her, would have required almost no change from her going forward, since the failure lived entirely outside her control by her own account. The honest version, involving her own delayed timeline, was harder to accept but also considerably more useful because it pointed directly at something she could actually fix next time. That's the underlying trade blame always makes. Comfort now, in exchange for a version of events that leaves you with nothing actionable to work with later. There's a version of this worth naming in personal relationships specifically, because blame in that context tends to be quieter and harder to catch than in a workplace failure. A partner who consistently frames every relationship conflict as something the other person caused, never quite landing on "here's what I could have done differently," is running Lisa's exact pattern, just spread across years instead of concentrated into a single failed event. The relationship version of the cost is the same too. Trust erodes gradually, and eventually the other partner simply stops believing that raising a concern will lead anywhere productive. There's also a subtler cost to constant blaming worth naming, one that has nothing to do with how other people eventually respond. Blame keeps you locked to a version of events where you had no real agency at all, which feels protective in the moment but is quietly disempowering over time. If the market was too tough, if the boss was biased, if the marketing team dropped the ball, every one of those explanations, even when partially true, also implicitly writes you out of the story as someone capable of having changed the outcome. Responsibility, by contrast, however uncomfortable it is to claim, restores exactly that agency. It says, implicitly, that you were a real actor in what happened, which also means you can be a real actor in what happens differently next time. The practical check worth applying whenever frustration or failure shows up: pause and ask directly, have I done everything I actually could have here? And is there something I genuinely could have done differently? Blaming, however satisfying it feels in the moment, has never once changed an actual outcome. Taking responsibility, however uncomfortable, is the only version of the response that changes you, which is ultimately the only thing genuinely within your control in the first place. 3. Arrogance over humility. Arrogance rarely announces itself honestly. It shows up disguised as confidence, competence, even leadership, right up until the moment it collides with reality and the mask slips. It's worth distinguishing arrogance from genuine self-assurance clearly here, because conflating the two is exactly how arrogance gets excused for as long as it usually does. Self-assurance is grounded in a track record and remains open to correction when the evidence calls for it. Arrogance is grounded in a need to be seen as right and treats correction, regardless of how well-founded it is, as an attack to be repelled rather than information to be used. The two can look nearly identical in a room full of people agreeing with you. They diverge sharply the moment someone disagrees. I watched this unfold with a manager at a large corporation. I'll call him Michael, who dominated every meeting he was part of, interrupting colleagues freely and openly mocking ideas he considered beneath his own. When a major project eventually collapsed, his explanation was immediate and entirely externalized. His team, he insisted, simply hadn't understood his brilliant vision. What had actually derailed the project, visible to nearly everyone except Michael himself, was his own refusal to listen, the arrogance that had shut down every piece of feedback that might have corrected course earlier, before the failure became unavoidable. When his own boss asked him to reflect honestly on what had gone wrong, Michael genuinely couldn't produce a single valid answer, because his arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that any part of the failure belonged to him. The useful distinction worth holding on to here is one the Stoics return to often. Humility was never about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less often, shifting the center of attention away from your own need to be seen as right, and toward whatever the actual problem in front of you requires. Arrogance prioritizes being validated. Humility prioritizes getting the right answer, regardless of whose idea it originally was. There's a version of this worth naming that shows up in fields where expertise is genuinely earned, which makes it more dangerous rather than less. A surgeon with a strong track record who stops taking a junior colleague's concerns seriously during a procedure purely because of the seniority gap is running the exact same pattern Michael ran in his meetings, just with considerably higher stakes attached to the outcome. Competence, ironically, tends to make this particular trap easier to fall into, because genuine past success provides a plausible-sounding cover story for refusing to listen the next time around. There's a specific, almost paradoxical version of arrogance worth naming too, because it doesn't look like the loud, dominating style Michael displayed in meetings. Some arrogance is quiet. It shows up as a settled certainty that your own judgment doesn't need to be checked against anyone else's, expressed not through interruption but through a kind of polite, smiling refusal to actually update anything based on what someone else just said. This quieter version is arguably harder to catch, both in others and in yourself, precisely because it never registers as rude. It just quietly ensures that every conversation ends up confirming what you already believed going in, regardless of what was actually said. The practical check worth running whenever you notice yourself dominating a conversation or dismissing someone else's input reflexively. Pause and ask honestly, am I doing this because I'm actually seeking the best answer, or because I'm seeking recognition for having one? Wisdom, in the end, was never about making the people around you feel smaller by comparison. It's about leaving them more capable than they were before the exchange, and arrogance, whatever short-term satisfaction it provides, makes that outcome nearly impossible to reach. 4. Lack of empathy. A lack of empathy is one of the clearest, most consistent markers of foolishness because it reflects a specific and fairly basic failure, the inability or unwillingness to imagine what someone else's experience might actually feel like from the inside, rather than from the comfortable distance of your own assumptions. It's worth being precise about what empathy actually requires, because it's easy to mistake for something softer and less demanding than it really is. Genuine empathy isn't simply feeling sorry for someone, and it isn't agreeing with them either. It's the more effortful act of temporarily setting aside your own frame of reference, your own priorities, your own read on what should have happened, long enough to actually inhabit theirs, even briefly. That's real cognitive work, not a passive emotional reflex, which is exactly why people under stress or self-focused pressure tend to skip it first, the same way any effortful task gets cut when time and attention run short. I knew a colleague, I'll call him Paul, who had a consistent habit of complaining loudly about project delays without ever pausing to investigate why they were happening. On one occasion, a coworker named Susan missed a deadline because her son had become seriously ill, and Paul, without gathering any of that context first, criticized her publicly in front of the entire team, focused entirely on the missed output and not remotely on the circumstances behind it. The irony arrived roughly a year later, when Paul found himself in an almost identical situation, caring for his own ailing mother while trying to keep up with work obligations. And it was only then, from the inside of that exact experience, that he finally understood how much his earlier criticism of Susan had actually cost her. What's worth understanding about a lack of empathy is that it doesn't just damage the immediate relationship in front of you. It quietly forecloses an entire category of learning that only becomes available through genuinely understanding someone else's situation. Paul's understanding of what Susan had gone through only arrived once he'd lived through a version of it himself, which is a genuinely limited and unreliable way to develop empathy, compared to simply choosing to extend it in advance, before your own life happens to force the lesson on you directly. There's a version of this worth naming in modern digital life specifically, because empathy gets tested constantly in contexts that strip away most of the normal cues that would otherwise trigger it. Someone posting a harsh, dismissive comment about a stranger's public misstep online is running Paul's exact pattern, just at a further remove and with even less visible cost attached. The absence of a face in front of you makes it considerably easier to skip the step where you imagine what the other person might actually be carrying. There's a related pattern worth naming too, because it explains why a lack of empathy so often survives well into adulthood without ever being seriously challenged. People who lack it rarely receive direct, honest feedback about the effect it's having, because the people on the receiving end are usually too hurt or too aware of the power dynamic involved to say so plainly. Paul's coworkers likely absorbed his public criticism of Susan quietly, without ever telling him directly how it had landed, which meant the only feedback loop available to him was the one he eventually got from living through a similar situation himself, a genuinely inefficient and unreliable way to develop a quality that could have been built far earlier through simple, deliberate attention to other people's circumstances. The Stoics treated genuine wisdom as something built through connection rather than pure accumulated knowledge. A person who knows a great deal but can't connect meaningfully with another human being's actual experience has acquired information without acquiring anything resembling wisdom. Empathy isn't a soft add-on to intelligence. It's closer to a prerequisite for the kind of understanding that actually holds up in the real, messy situations life keeps producing. The practical starting point, whenever you catch yourself judging someone's behavior without context, is simple to name and genuinely hard to practice consistently. Pause and listen without judgment first. treating the assumption that you already understand their situation as the thing to actively resist rather than the thing to default to. 5. Fear of change. Comfort zones feel safe precisely because they are, in a narrow sense, familiar, predictable, free of the specific discomfort that comes with doing something for the first time. The trouble is that comfort, held on to past its useful life, quietly turns into a kind of prison, and the person inside it rarely notices the walls closing in until the world outside has moved considerably further than they realized. It's worth naming why this particular trap is so easy to fall into, because it doesn't feel like a mistake while it's happening. It feels like stability, even wisdom, the kind of grounded consistency that gets praised in almost every other context. The difference between healthy consistency and fear-driven stagnation is subtle but real. Consistency holds steady because the current approach is still working and remains genuinely open to evidence that it stopped. Stagnation holds steady regardless of the evidence, because the actual goal was never optimizing the outcome. It was avoiding the specific discomfort of doing something unfamiliar. I think of a man I once knew. I'll call him Michael, a different Michael than the one from the Arrogance story, who spent his entire life in the same small neighborhood, knowing every corner and every face in it. When his grown children eventually encouraged him to move somewhere with better opportunities and closer proximity to them, his response was immediate. "I know everyone here. Why should I go somewhere else?" For a while, that answer held up reasonably well. Then the neighborhood itself began to change around him. Old friends moved away one by one. Familiar shops shut their doors, and the specific comfort he'd been protecting started evaporating anyway, entirely outside his control. Eventually, he made the move he'd resisted for years, and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that the new environment brought not just comfort, but genuine opportunities he'd never have encountered if he'd kept refusing to leave. What's worth understanding about the fear of change is that it rarely protects you from anything in the way it promises to. The world keeps moving whether or not you move with it, and the actual choice isn't between change and no change. It's between change on your own terms, chosen deliberately, or change forced on you eventually by circumstances you didn't have any say in. Michael's neighborhood changed regardless of his resistance to leaving it. The only thing his resistance actually controlled was how long he delayed benefiting from a shift that was, in the end, going to happen either way. There's a version of this worth naming in careers specifically, because it plays out constantly and rarely gets named directly. Someone who refuses to learn a new piece of software or a new way of working purely because the old method still technically functions is running Michael's exact pattern, betting that familiarity will outlast the actual pace of change happening around them, a bet that eventually stops paying off for almost everyone who makes it. The Stoics treated change as a basic, unavoidable fact of existence rather than a threat to be resisted, something to be met with an open hand rather than a clenched one, because clenching never actually stops the thing you're afraid of. It just costs you the ability to shape how you meet it. There's a version of this worth naming in relationships too, distinct from careers, because the fear of change shows up there in a subtler form, as reluctance to update a relationship's dynamic even after both people involved have clearly changed. A marriage that keeps running on the same unspoken rules and roles established a decade earlier, even after both partners have grown into different people with different needs, is a quieter version of Michael's refusal to move, not out of any active decision to stay stuck, but out of the same instinct to protect a familiar structure past the point where it's actually still serving anyone inside it. The practical question worth asking whenever you notice yourself avoiding a change purely out of discomfort: what's genuinely the worst realistic outcome here? And what's genuinely the best one? held side by side honestly. That question tends to reveal how disproportionate the fear usually is relative to the actual stakes involved, and life, as Michael eventually discovered, doesn't hold still waiting for anyone to feel ready. 6. Talking more than listening. Of all 6 signs, this is the one that does its damage most quietly, because it rarely looks like cruelty or incompetence from the outside. It looks like enthusiasm, someone who simply has a lot to say, always, in every conversation about everything. It's worth being honest about why this particular pattern is so hard to self-diagnose, compared to the other 5 on this list. A closed mind, arrogance, a lack of empathy. All of these tend to produce visible friction eventually, a conflict or a failure dramatic enough to force some reflection. Talking more than listening rarely produces that kind of forcing event. It just produces a slow, cumulative quiet, people offering less, engaging less, until the absence itself becomes the new normal, with no single moment sharp enough to prompt the person doing the talking to ask what changed. I think of a father I once knew, I'll call him John, who monopolized nearly every family dinner conversation, night after night, without seeming to notice he was doing it. His kids would start describing something that happened at school, and John would interrupt within a sentence or two to pivot the conversation back toward one of his own stories. When his wife raised ideas about improving the family's finances, he dismissed them outright, convinced his own approach was simply the correct one and not really open to discussion. What made this pattern genuinely tragic, rather than merely annoying, was how invisible it was to John himself. He had no real sense of how consistently his family was walking away from these dinners feeling unheard and, over time, quietly undervalued. What's worth understanding about this pattern is that listening isn't actually a passive state you fall into when you happen to have nothing to say. It's an active skill, requiring genuine attention and a real willingness to let someone else's perspective take priority, even temporarily, over your own. The Stoics treated listening as one of the more direct pathways to wisdom precisely because it requires setting your own voice aside long enough to actually take in something you didn't already know. Talking without that pause, no matter how articulate the talking is, produces nothing new. It's closer to scattering seeds across ground that was never prepared to receive them. There's a version of this worth naming that shows up constantly in modern workplace culture, specifically among people who are objectively skilled at their jobs. A brilliant engineer or strategist who talks over every junior colleague's half-formed idea, convinced their own experience makes further listening unnecessary, is running John's exact pattern in a different setting, and the cost compounds the same way it did at John's dinner table. Colleagues, like children, eventually stop bringing anything to the table at all, having learned that offering it rarely gets a genuine hearing. There's a specific, almost invisible cost to this pattern worth naming, because it doesn't show up as an argument or an obvious conflict. It shows up as absence. John's family didn't fight him on his monopolizing of every dinner conversation. They simply, gradually, stopped offering as much, adjusting their own expectations downward about how much airtime they'd realistically get. That kind of quiet withdrawal is considerably harder to notice than an open conflict, precisely because nothing dramatic ever happens to flag that something's wrong. The relationship just slowly gets thinner, one unshared story at a time, until the distance becomes the new normal without anyone ever naming the moment it started. If any part of John's story landed uncomfortably close to home, the practical fix is available and specific. The next time your child, your partner, or a colleague starts sharing something, resist the reflex to wait for your turn to speak, and instead actually try to understand what they're describing before responding to it. That single habit, practiced consistently, tends to do more for a relationship's health than almost any amount of well-intentioned advice offered from the talking side of the table ever could. The wise person, in the end, listens. The foolish one only talks. So we've walked through all 6 signs together: a closed mind, constant blaming, arrogance over humility, a lack of empathy, fear of change, and talking more than listening. Before you click away wondering whether you're the stupid person this video was describing, it's worth being honest about something. Every single one of us has displayed at least one of these 6 at some point, probably more recently than we'd like to admit. Maybe it was arrogance in a specific argument. Maybe it was clinging too tightly to a comfort zone you knew, somewhere underneath, had already stopped serving you. Maybe it's simply talking too much without actually listening, in a relationship you genuinely care about. None of that makes you the fool this video is describing. Recognizing these signs was never really about judgment. It was about creating the specific kind of awareness that makes improvement possible in the first place. The Stoics understood wisdom as a continuous practice rather than a fixed state you either have or don't, built through continually learning, admitting mistakes honestly, and staying willing to grow past whatever version of yourself showed up yesterday. Each of these 6 traits, uncomfortable as it is to recognize in yourself, is really just an invitation disguised as a flaw, a specific, actionable place to start doing better. What's worth carrying forward, past the 6 specific examples, is the underlying pattern connecting all of them. Every single one is, at bottom, a strategy for avoiding a particular kind of discomfort in the short term, at a cost that only becomes visible much later, once the pattern has repeated enough times to become a reputation, a stalled career, or a relationship that's quietly thinned out over years. The fix, in every case, runs through the same uncomfortable door, choosing the harder, more honest response in the moment, rather than the easier one that only feels like protection. Step out of the comfort zone you've been protecting. Listen more than you talk. Blame less and own more. This particular journey was never meant for anyone perfect. It's meant for anyone willing to look honestly at themselves and say, simply, I can do better than this, and then actually go do it.